do I do?
So I suppose on to Lecter then. It's quite an interesting little test case for, especially for pop cultural, but for the smartest of serial killers. He's obviously based on a bunch of them. We did cover the Dark Triad before. In your professional opinion, do you think he hits all three of those, or would you say it's...
I think he certainly hits the sort of Machiavellian and psychopathy, and he has a certain amount of narcissism, but not to a large degree. Like, he cares a lot about manners and propriety, which is actually quite a considerate thing in a way. It's not necessarily narcissistic because you're putting others' needs above your own if you care about those sorts of things.
Yeah, I was going to ask as well, with narcissism, this might mean being outside the clinical literature. Is it that it's an inflated sense of self that goes beyond what's actually justified? Because obviously Lecter is very competent. He's got a large taste profile. In the book, he's sort of Lithuanian count. Obviously, Hopkins's portrayal definitely changes that, but he comes from a very wealthy background. So it's not unfair for him to have quite a high opinion of himself in terms of aristocracy, intelligence. It's just morally, he's utterly depraved. So would he fit the typical narcissist category?
I think it's the one that he fits the least. I think he still fits it to a relatively good degree, but I think that one of the problems with the actual Dark Triad is that it doesn't take into account that, someone could be more competent than average and self-assess that same way, and it would rate them as being more narcissistic even if they were better at something. So it's a somewhat limited test because it's based on self-perception, and so if you're accurate in your assessment but you are genuinely more effective at what you do, then the test is limited. And I think that might be the case here, where actually his opinion of himself is quite reflective of how he actually is. He's not self-aggrandizing, really, is he?
Most serial killers keep some sort of trophies from their victims.
I didn't.
No, you ate yours.
So I did a little bit of research into the sort of true crime history inspirations for Lecter, and I found out that it was weirdly prophetic, if anything, because Jeffrey Dahmer was caught in the same year as Silence of the Lambs film released, and there's the Conversations with the Killer Jeffrey Dahmer tapes on Netflix, which are actually not very well put together. But in the episode 1's introduction, his psychological assessor literally says she felt like Clarice Starling from the Silence of the Lambs when interviewing him, which is kind of apt. And then in Dennis Nielsen's own self-recorded tapes, for those who don't know, he was like England's Jeffrey Dahmer in many respects. A gay guy who took people home, drugged them, cut them up, put them down the drain. That's how he got caught. He was flushing human bodies down the drain.
Doesn't seem... That's way too much faith in our
in our public utilities.
Systems,
He actually, there was a rumour in the press running that he had a poster of Hannibal Lecter in his cell, as if he was some kind of idol. But the obvious one, Lecter is based mostly on, is Bundy, because Bundy was brought in to being interviewed by the FBI's BSU to catch the Green River Killer, which is Gary Ridgway. So in 1984, Bundy had actually reached out to the members of the BSU in prison to offer his assistance, and by then he'd killed... Well, in the end, he'd killed 48 people, but they hadn't found that many bodies yet, because eventually Ridgway was taken out on walks, and the only way he could remember all of his killings and confess to them was where he'd be disposed of the women. Bundy was actually apparently eerily accurate in saying where all the bodies would be, how the disposal methods would be, why he would keep returning to the scene of the crimes to commit necrophilia, which is kind of disgusting. So then Robert Keppel, who was a detective on the case, said the predictions about the killer were largely a projection of himself, because he hadn't confessed up to that time, and that his respect for the detective had prompted him to open up about the crimes. In 2019, columnist David Von Driel proclaimed that Bundy was no Hannibal Lecter, but rather a savagely violent sex criminal that tricked the public into perceiving him as a suave up-and-comer. But Hannibal himself, like Bundy, had his likeable facade, of course, as we've already covered, and that's why Harris has said, I actually based a large part of it on Bundy from the televised trials and the case notes, which came out afterwards. So just an interesting little tidbits there. So Hannibal himself, there's major differences between the novel and the film that not a lot of people know. As we've already said, he was basically a Lithuanian count. He also has a photographic memory in both. In the book, he's described weirdly like a gothic vampire figure, like you in Contemplations recently.
Or in general.
Ooh. he had a sixth extra finger on his left hand.
That was very strange. I don't know why they included that.
No, I think it's just a freakish detail to make him seem inhuman. But yeah, it's rather uncharacteristic because not many people do of these serial killers.
It was a bit of a crass addition that added nothing,
Yeah.
I think.
Well, most of the reason serial killers get away with it is because they seem like normal people. And even though he's ingratiated into the high-class dining, all of these music recitals, he's a well-respected psychologist for the Baltimore practice, to the aristocracy of America, if there is such a thing. He's clearly quite a weird-looking, diminutive man. I mean, he's short, slender, slick back, black hair, sharp teeth, red eyes, and a sixth finger. It's like I find it difficult when it says that people who are in high society, people get more if they're more attractive. It's the halo effect, of course. It is a lot more difficult to believe that he would be getting away with so much or get so many opportunities or be ingratiated in these circles if he does look so freakish.
Yeah, I did think that it would have had far more power in the story if they made him a bit more normal, I suppose. Maybe even slightly exceptional, as in it makes you start to question, well, he's so exceptional, maybe I'm wrong. And of course, you'll say, oh yeah, well, he's a serial killer, of course I'm not. But then the fact it takes you back would have far more power.
That's why Dahmer and Bundy got away with it for quite a long time. You know, they knew how to manipulate the police, they knew how to talk to law enforcement, they were not functional people, obviously, but they were seen as attractive people in their circles. Dahmer took many men home of their own volition and only drugged them after they were already in the apartment. Bundy lured many women away by being deceptive and charming. He was ingratiated into the Republican Party. He was ingratiated into the Church of Latter-day Saints. He was a law student. He had a girlfriend long-term. So these people were capable of having a functional veneer. Hannibal has a functional facade in that he's very competent in his psychological practice, but yeah, it's very difficult to see someone who looks so out of the norm to do so well. So I think the film does a lot better there. The Harris said, I've never watched any of the films because I'm worried that Hopkins will change my interpretation of the character in my own mind because he's become such a vital piece of the adaptation.
I think Hopkins makes the role, doesn't he?
Yeah.
I think when I was reading the book, because I'd seen the film first, I was imagining Anthony Hopkins, and it made me enjoy the book more than I just pretended that the details that I didn't like about the character didn't exist, just so I could enjoy it more.
Brave Clarice, you will let me know when those lambs stop screaming, won't you?
There was actually an interesting dichotomy there between the book and the film, because I've seen a lot of people call the film a horror film. I don't think that's the case, especially because there's not much gore. It's definitely not a slasher, and the predominance of horror has been slashers and jump scares in recent years. But it's more akin to Psycho, for example. And I think there's an interesting dynamic here of where you get the final girl trope in horror. That's mainly set by something like Halloween, for example. A little bit of interesting information I told you yesterday that I found out is that Jamie Lee Curtis's mother, she was the woman who was stabbed in the famous shower scene in Psycho. So that's just quite a little bit of fun. Name's Jarrett Lee. So there's been readings of the final girl trope as the virtuous virginal feminine versus the excessively shadow-like masculine. And that's been a running thing. That's why so many teenagers are slashed up and punished for promiscuous sex. And it's not just a marketing technique to say, oh, loads of teenagers come and see our film so they want to see themselves getting killed, which is actually a weird thing apparently that people do like to do. Representation matters, I guess, but it's also this meta-narrative that's running under it.
It's also a weird condemnation of society that the films with the most moral messaging are the horror films.
Yeah, not great, is it? But I think this does turn it on its head, because with Lecter being so competent and charming, specifically in the film, even though he's very disturbing when Clarice first meets him with the iconic hiss and the threat to eat the census taker, you wouldn't have the same inversion of the final girl trope with the monster, the killer, actually being transsexual and the dark feminine, and the aide, the sort of helpful hand, the almost Yoda-like figure in this, being the dark masculine, and there's this weird intermingled undertone of both romance and mentor. If Lecter had looked like he had in the novel, he needs to come across as normal, dignified, clean, clear-cut. So I think Hopkins really does sell it on it. Also, the Americans love an English accent for a villain, don't they? So
they really do. I mean, it's been a staple source of work for many. An English actor is being villains in American TV shows and films.
One of the sources of contention I did have, though, it's really interesting, and we spoke about this yesterday, is upon his introduction, of course, you have Miggs say the rather lewd comment to Starling, and Lecter brings it up and says, I, for one, cannot smell your vagina from a distance. I can smell your skin cream and your perfume, which you're not wearing today. The interesting thing that we found, that we were discussing, is that may actually be inaccurate for psychopaths, because the potential bit of damage to their so you'll be able to say this better. The orbitofrontal cortex, is that right?
There we frontal
go.
Cortex.
Got it in one. Apparently, this leads to poorer olfactory discrimination identification. So they can't smell as well as most people. And they did a sort of sniff test with about 70 registered psychopaths, some of them convicted of crimes, of different smelling coloured markers. And they couldn't tell the difference between most of the flavours and smells, even though they were quite distinct, like orange, coffee, and leather, for example. So it's quite interesting they've put that little tidbit in.
Yeah, there are two ways to just anecdotally spot a psychopath, whether they have a good sense of smell and whether they yawn after you do, as in like a catchy yawn, which you don't do you?
I don't, apparently.
But
we've done that on air.
How's your sense of smell?
It's pretty good. I'm
Is it?
saved.
Okay.
I'm fine. There we go. Oh dear. But yeah, so it's quite an interesting detail that I think they added in the book, and it carried over to the film without passing the psychological sniff test, pardon the pun, just to make him more predatory. But then obviously he loses that over time.
It makes a beast out of him a little bit, which I didn't really like. I felt like it was an unnecessary part of the character that made him less believable. Like the character in the book particularly, it becomes a little bit silly. Just like, oh yeah, he's got 6 fingers, he basically looks like a vampire, and also he's got really good sense of smell. I mean, they've all but said, yeah, he can disappear into a cloud of bats.
Yeah. They also compared him to Prince Andrew, which is quite funny. Like literally page 6
but in a
of the
positive way, though.
Yeah,
like
I said, it was predictive.
To watch the full video, please become a premium member at lotuseaters.com.